This one here, if you are at the Global Cafe, will focus on the term complexity. And the format will be the same as the previous one. We have a brief 10-minute introductory statement from one of our commentators and campus participants, followed by two short 5-minute statements from some experts. And then the goal is to not have a traditional Q&A session, but to have a discussion across the audience, including, of course, the speakers. So we won't ask the panel to reconvene up here to dispense more wisdom, but rather to have a discussion among everybody who is in the audience. So without further ado, let me introduce the participants. Myself, I'm Manfred Laubichler. I'm one of the campus instructors and was involved in the organization to some extent. I'm a biologist and historian, and for the purpose of this seminar, you might want to know that I'm also an external professor at the Santa Fe Institute. But I'm the least important person. Let's go to the most important person. That she has 10 minutes. That defines importance here. Alejandra Torres Camprudi. She is a public international lawyer thinking hard about the role of law in the Anthropocene. In that context, she's part of a research project at the Fridtjof Nansen Institute in Oslo that focuses on climate change and sea level rise in the Anthropocene as a challenge for international law. She has law degrees from several European countries, so how she can keep anything straight is an exercise in complexity by itself. Alejandra.
I may not be able to. So thank you very much, Manfred, for this fantastic and very nice and kind presentation, and for the organizers to trust me with this concept. I thought that rather than giving or starting with sort of a pre-established definition of what complexity is and, bore you, basically, I thought that I'd better reframe from the urge of Googling what complexity can mean, and instead explore how this concept has come up in this grand conversation that we've been having for about 10 days. And from the notes I took about how complexity was referred to in these conversations, I try to extract some functions that this concept may serve as to guide us through this grand conversation. And it is through the exploration of these functions that several and multiple different understandings of the concept of complexity have emerged. So this has, by the way, given me the idea that complexity is in itself complex when we understand complexity as multidimensional or chameleonic concept. So the first main function that I think clearly comes out from our conversations is that complexity essentially sets the limits of knowledge production about the Anthropocene. That the minute we acknowledge that the Anthropocene is a multidimensional concept, we are also acknowledging that we cannot apprehend this concept comprehensively. So complexity as opposed to comprehensiveness is the first conclusion I came out with. The second function is more concrete and perhaps more practical and derived from the first one. The second function of complexity, for me, pinpoints at the disciplinary tensions that emerge as a result of precisely this need that we have to apprehend the Anthropocene through new paradigms and new methodologies. So essentially, complexity would reveal not just the limit of knowledge itself and knowledge production itself, but also the limits of the means to access such knowledge through methodological tools. And so I thought that within this second function, complexity would essentially reveal different types of challenges, whether we are in the realm of the social sciences or in the realm of the natural sciences. So I am a lawyer, and therefore I am part of the bigger cluster of social sciences. I think that for social scientists, complexity is not at all alien to our disciplines, that in fact we inherently work with complexity in the sense that we know that all we worked with and all we produce is somehow wicked. It's multidimensional, and we don't expect or pretend to have absolute truth about anything, unless, of course, you find or you bump into a very dogmatic professor, which, of course, there are many of those out there, very big divas and egos, but normally we acknowledge that knowledge is relative. And as a result of that, perhaps precisely as a result of the acknowledgement that we do not work with absolute truth, social sciences tend to be extremely conservative about their paradigms and the methodologies that we use. I think this is a sort of a survival strategy somehow. In the natural sciences, please, all natural scientists of the room, if I am wrong, say it. But from a conversation with Miriam last night, she explained to me that some natural sciences disciplines can be very reductionist in the sense that they can be very tightly constrained when it comes to take into account the real world into their experiments. Although the problems they are working with can be complex in themselves, they might or they tend to lose sight of the reality in which those experiments are located. And yet, what the natural sciences have is a natural pleasure for the unknown and the unforeseen. They're particularly apt for experimentation, which is not so common or not so easy for social scientists. So I see that between the social sciences and natural sciences have to face different challenges. For social scientists, I think the Anthropocene and the complexity that it carries with it will push social scientists to become, or to try to be more open to experimental tools and more intuitive, perhaps, tools, whereas the natural sciences may be pushed towards accepting more relativism and being more engaging with somehow the real world. So I finish with this second function. Complexity essentially tells us that we have to pay attention to the tensions between disciplines, as they are called to work together to understand as much as we can about the Anthropocene and to produce knowledge about the Anthropocene, but also the tensions within each of our disciplines. And now the third function I came out with, going through my notes, is that complexity seems to reveal also the dangers of acting through the Anthropocene. I think this came out in particular when Adrian Lahu was presenting its seminar on geopolitics, and pointed out on how different images or different ways in which the Anthropocene can crystallize in the real world is likely to be easily manipulated by different actors, political actors subject to different competing interests, etc., etc. So the third function would be that it reveals the danger of acting through the Anthropocene. Now, how may this concept of complexity be useful when it comes to the production of a curriculum for this, to somehow leave a trace of these 10 days of grand conversation about the Anthropocene? In my opinion, I think complexity essentially obliges us to try to find simplicity in the way we talk about the Anthropocene. Simplicity doesn't mean simplification, but I think we really need to make an effort not to overindulge in our complexity and not to become too pedantic, especially if we want to take this concept, which this new way of thinking the world outside of these four walls, outside of simply a scholarly discussion, and really see how it will, progressively have an impact in societies, in governments, in local communities, etc. I think that finding a clear, straightforward language is absolutely fundamental, and that in doing so we have to think over about how our pedagogic function as somehow the ambassadors of this concept. That's all I have for you. Thank you.
Thank you, Alejandra, for coming in 2 minutes under the allocated time. Let's see whether we can hold that trend. Our next speaker is Miriam Diamond. Miriam is a professor in the Department of Earth Sciences at the University of Toronto. She is also trained as a chemist, although as with most people who work in interesting interdisciplinary areas, the disciplinary community doesn't believe she's a chemist, she told me, but that's the fate of people who do something interesting. Her work focuses mostly on the role of toxins in environmental systems, and her research group deploys a variety of approaches such as modeling, experiments, measurements, and developing policy strategies. So obviously, she herself embodies a very complex system. Miriam.
Thank you, Manfred, for that very kind introduction. I'm very pleased to be here, and Alejandra for so eloquently bringing us through the world of complexity to point out 3 key points. So I'm going to build on what Alejandra has said. We had a very good conversation yesterday. I'm going to start by being autobiographical, and the intention of my comments is to convey what I have learned about complexity and moving forward to empower students. So I'm going to speak autobiographically. I was an undergraduate in the 1970s. I was an undergraduate at the time that the very seminal work of Limits to Growth was published, and also Paul Ehrlich's Population Time Bomb. That was in '68. It was a time of incredible urgency and energy, that the world was changing rapidly in ways that we could not control and ways that would bring our demise. Limits to Growth was a simplification of the complex world, looking at 5 components of the world. It predicted a population crash that would come sometime in this century. These were very disturbing and non-intuitive trends. I went into ecology because of my concern for ecological communities and their ability to continue. But I found that ecologists almost reveled in complexity. As Alejandra said, it was that there was almost an indulgence in the notion of complexity. I found that complexity, that the goal was to describe systems, but that you couldn't move forward with solutions. So because I'm very solution-focused, I went into engineering. Engineering is the antithesis of ecology, and I should mention that ecology was almost the reaction against reductionist science. Ecology was the notion of trying to understand complexity as an antidote to the reductionist science that Alejandra mentioned. But I went into engineering because engineers are the consummate problem solvers. You have a problem, we'll solve it. A lack of data does not get in the way of engineers solving problems. But there are very important lessons to learn. So we shouldn't conflate the idea that, say, engineering has wrought all these terrible problems on us with the positive aspect that the methods of simplification and problem solving can actually be very powerful. My research, I grapple with complexity, but understand that it's the simple stories that empower us and enable us to move solutions, to promote solutions to wicked problems of the Anthropocene. I continue to appreciate and be very concerned about what Thomas Homer Dixon calls the ingenuity gap. The ingenuity gap is the critical gap and the growing gap between our needs to solve complex problems and the supply of ideas and our cognitive ability to grapple with complexity. So, when I confront a first-year class of undergraduates, I confront an increasingly, a population that is increasingly turned off, alienated from our complex world, and embrace skepticism and cynicism as a way to cope with complexity. Cynicism kills your interest in agency. Cynicism is a way to hide from complexity, or to say, I understand complexity, but I can't do anything about it. So cynicism is a coping mechanism to deal with complexity that sucks dry your agency. My duty is to empower students, is to digest that complexity, and to give students the agency and the will to move forward, understanding there is never one way to move forward. We need multiple ways of moving forward, but what we do need is your buy-in and the actions of moving forward. My duty is to simplify trends in the Anthropocene to allow students to grasp this and to change. I also appreciate the cognitive psychology. George Miller said there are only 7 ideas, plus or minus 2, that we can actually hold in our head at any one time. 1 minute? So we have to work with that. Now, I'd like to finish on adding one more element, and that's the internet, that is so much a part of the Anthropocene. At once, the internet introduces complexity because we have so many nodes and so much knowledge out there. On the other hand, the internet is actually reducing complexity by homogenizing ideas and homogenizing the world. The other thing the internet does is to seduce us, because the internet is, I believe, the junk food of the mind. So that my first-year students are busy on Facebook while I'm trying to convey the complexity and the urgency of the Anthropocene. I find that a very wicked problem. So we need complexity to understand problems, but we also need to understand that it's actually simple stories, and often it's the simple solutions that carry the day. Thank you.
Thank you, Miriam. Particularly thank you for this nice metaphor of the internet as the junk food. It might explain a kind of intellectual obesity crisis that we see. So our final speaker here is Andy Pickering, who needs very little introduction because he has had a career introducing himself to many different communities, ranging from physicists to science and technology study communities, sociologists, and even philosophers. So Andy is one of the leaders of the modern version of science and technology studies. He is currently at the University of Exeter in the Department of Philosophy and Sociology. Andy.
Okay, got to be clear. Complexity, can you hear me okay? Is it working? Complexity must be a key term in any Anthropocene curriculum. Technically, the word points us towards mathematical models of systems composed of many interacting elements. But I want to emphasize its philosophical, even ontological implications. Complexity is beyond complicated. The word itself conveys the sense that we are not in charge, which is precisely what we need to know and take to heart when we're thinking about earthbound knowledge. Something is happening here and we don't know what it is. Who said that? Bob Dylan. I'll sing it for you if you like. Ecologists and environmentalists realized this a long time ago. The sixth principle of Arne Naess's 1973 manifesto for deep ecology is, quote, complexity, not complication. And Naess elaborated that in a very interesting way, twinning the concept of complexity with that of human ignorance. Naess insisted that we are necessarily ignorant of complex systems, like, for example, ecosystems. This sounds defeatist, but we can think of it in a positive way by invoking another idea, which is unfortunately missing from today's list of key terms, namely emergence. To say that systems have emergent properties means, for me, that however much we know about them, they can always surprise us. And this potential for surprise is exactly the measure of our ignorance, an ignorance which is not a gap to be filled in by more knowledge, it's a gap that will never go away. A corollary of this is that we can't impose our will on complex systems, so we have to learn to get along with them. An idea beautifully evoked by Gregory Bateson. Quote, I think that the functioning of such hierarchies may be compared with the business of trying to back a truck to which one or more trailers are attached. Each segmentation of such a system denotes a reversal of sign, and when we consider the problem of controlling a second trailer, the threshold for jackknifing is drastically reduced, and control becomes, therefore, almost negligible. As I see it, this is Bateson still, the world is made up of a very complex network of such entities, but with this difference, that many of the entities have their own supplies of energy and perhaps even their own ideas of where they would like to go. End of quote. When Bateson came up with this image in 1959, he was actually thinking about schizophrenia, not the environment. 10 years later, he made a connection between the two spheres, speaking of, quote, the madness of the cornfields. I suppose that ecosystems and human minds are paradigmatic examples of complex systems, always surprising, never under control. And I suppose that if we taught our children that, they lived in a world of complex systems, they would act differently from us. Command and control approaches to the environment and to madness would seem unnatural to them. Adaptive approaches would come naturally instead. The question for an Anthropocene curriculum, as I see it, is how to get this across. I get my students to read case studies of the interactions of people and things. But one could go down a level and just show students emergent systems that always surprise us. And I just want to mention 3 of them quickly. The first one behind me is technical. Mathematical systems called cellular automata. Patterns of zeros and ones generated by iterating a very simple rules. Here, the rule is shown at the bottom, and succeeding applications of the rule generate a pattern that evolves downwards, step by step, starting from a single 1 at the top. The important point is that it turns out there's no way to predict the distribution of zeros and ones at any given iteration, apart from just running the rule and finding out what the system will do. This cellular automata can always surprise us. It's the simplest example I know of an emergent system. My next example is from the arts. This is a robot called Petit Mal, built by the artist Simon Penny. It's a mobile robot that engages in open-ended dances with human participants. And any given dance is an emergent joint product of the robot and the human. Neither partner is in control of the other. They have to act together to produce this dance. Finally, games are interesting and instructive. Tangrams, these things behind me, are made from 7 simple geometrical elements. The goal is to put them together to produce a desired outline. And the first thing you learn when you try to make any given shape is that there is no linear or computational route to the desired end. You just have to experiment and see what turns out, which is just what we need to know about the world we actually live in. We still teach our children that the world is predictable, a predictable and controllable place, but the Anthropocene teaches us that this isn't true. Now we need to help the next generation to think about the world as being built from emergent, complex systems like cellular automata, dancing robots, and tangrams. And I think the world would be a better place if we did so. That's it.